from Noys is going to speak for the second part. Dr. Noys is from the University of Chichester. He's a reader in English there, but he also writes extensively on social, political theory, aesthetics, film, etc. So it's great to have him here. And we'll let you start.
Thank you very much. Okay, so firstly, thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak. Appropriately, I think this was written with some sense of urgency, but it is a properly written paper, so we'll see. So what I want to do really is offer some preliminary and speculative reflections on the problems of urgency and abstraction in the present moment. And what follows is restricted reflection on a transition that I want to mark in the way we think of the relationship between urgency and abstraction. Although I'd argue that the mode of thinking that I will trace is quite widespread. In particular, I want to trace the transition from a distance between urgency and abstraction to their proximity, from separation to fusion, although we'll see matters are a little more complicated. So urgency is usually contrasted with abstraction. Urgency is the time of the political, of action, of the demand, while abstraction is the time of the philosophical, of contemplation, and of reflection. They remain separate and belong to different temporal modes. If this is the classical view, to offer something of a cliche, I then want to sketch the present moment as one of the fusion of abstraction and urgency. Under the felt pressure of what Zonrettel called real abstraction, the lived experience of abstractions in crisis become more real than we'd imagined. The tendency is to claim a license for urgency as a result. And this is what I want to call the contemporary insurrectional imaginary, in which the pressure of abstraction drives urgent political action. In relation to the legacy of Stuart Hall, which is part of the focus of this conference, I want to question this collapsing of abstraction and urgency into one moment. Returning to Hall's statement of Marxism without guarantees, I want to suggest that we can find echoes of the theoretical debates into which Hall was intervening and the present moment. While not denying the necessity to link urgency and abstraction, Hall's work suggests the complexity and difficulty of this process. In this way, we can think cultural studies, or something like cultural studies, and the particular inflection that Hall would give to this field as a mode of mediating urgency and abstraction without separating them. So first, I want to sketch in a fairly brutally reductive fashion what we could call the classical modelling of urgency and abstraction. And here there is a separation between the two. In the first case of separation, we have to step back from urgency into abstraction as the necessary condition of later urgency. In the Marxist tradition, we could think of Marx's retreat into the British Library to write Capital after his experience of defeat in 1850. The writing of Capital, the work of patient labour and abstraction, I can't resist my footnote. This is Lyotard's famous remark on Capital. He says, the perpetual postponement of finishing work on Capital, a chapter becoming a book, a section a chapter, a paragraph a section by process of cancerization of theoretical discourse. So those of you about to embark on a PhD, that's your model. The writing of Capital, the work of patient labour and abstraction, is the condition for the thinking of the urgency incarnated by the Paris Commune. So Marx retreats from the defeats of 1848, post-1848, retreats into the library, writes Capital, and then is galvanised back into urgency by the Commune of 1871. The failed struggles of 1848 find their true relay in the new proletarian struggles, question, of 1871. Similarly, we could recall Lenin reading Hegel after the capitulation of social democracy to war fever in 1914. Again, a retreat to study abstraction becomes the later condition for urgency. Lenin's rereading of the Logic makes possible the leap into urgent action in 1917, in contrast to the timidity, or to their mind prudence, of his colleagues. On the publication of the April theses, Bogdanov characterised them as the delirium of a madman. And Nadzeja Krupskaya remarks, "I'm afraid it looks like Lenin has gone crazy." The logic in these cases is anticipatory. A necessary work of and on abstraction is required to prepare for urgent action, the moment of kairos or fortuna. In Lenin's remark, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. Theory, a work of abstraction, is a necessarily patient act of preparation for urgent action. Initial separation prepares a future fusion of urgency and abstraction in terms of an insurrection against abstraction. This fusion, however, is still one guided and organised by the instance of reflection, usually embodied in the party. So this is one separation. Retreating to abstraction to prepare urgency. Another modulation of this separation is beginning from urgency to move back to abstraction. In his preface to Volume 1 of Capital, Althusser remarked that intellectual specialists failed to understand Capital, while, quote, the militants of the workers' movement have understood this same book despite its difficulties. This is due to the book speaking to their, quote, everyday reality, and so Capital becomes the Bible of the movement, due to its abstraction speaking to the urgency of the immediate conditions of the workers. So workers grasp Capital because they live the abstractions that Capital describes. In this case, urgency and abstraction appear to be more closely linked. The urgency of everyday life under Capital appears to license an understanding of its abstraction. That said, this urgency of the worker's condition for Althusser only allows them access to, quote, an apprenticeship in abstraction. Here we approach from the other side. The urgency of struggle has to find itself reflected in the forms of abstraction that dominate it. The workers encountering this work of, quote, pure theory need, again to quote, to get used to the practice of abstraction. So workers have an insight, an initial insight, but they require an apprenticeship to formulate this practice of reading. Althusser's advice was notoriously to, he does this in capital letters, so I feel like I should shout it, but I'm not going to, put the whole of part one aside for the time being, which is to say, to put aside the discussion of the abstraction of the commodity form, which renders this apprenticeship in abstraction rather problematic, I would say. So, from both the directions I've just briefly sketched, from abstraction to urgency, or from urgency to abstraction, there is a necessary delay. It is the knowledge of abstraction in both cases which equips us with the capacity to act with the correct urgency, striking at the weakest or the strongest link with surety. Fulvio Jesi, the Italian thinker, summarizes the logic of revolution as requiring, quote, a correct evaluation of the times grounded in the analysis of socio-economic conditions and the balance of forces present within them. Patient work in abstraction is not an end in itself, which could be regarded as a cliche of the philosophy. Philosophy would be abstraction as an end in itself. It is the necessary moment of delay to allow a relay to urgent action. So that, briefly, is my attempt to sketch a classical model. And this mode of thinking has come under stringent and repeated critique by Jacques Rancière. In fact, it runs through the whole of Rancière's work. From his Althusser's lesson of 1974, where Rancière insisted Althusserianism was an essentially pedagogic institution, where, quote, the masses can make history because the heroes make its theory, to his recent 2010 contribution to the idea of communism volume, where he argues classical Marxism rests on the impotence and disempowerment of the masses who need to be guided through abstraction, his argument has been consistent. He argues that a model of domination in which power dissimulates itself results in savants with the exalted task of bringing their science to the blind masses. So the implication here is that the knowledge of abstraction is reserved for a class or group who understand abstraction and then bring that knowledge to others. Althusser's turn to the immediacy of workers' experience, I just mentioned his preface to Capital, and you know there's a sort of turn in Althusser from this kind of high theoreticism to a faith in the experience of workers and class struggle. This turn in Althusser merely repeats the problem, according to Rancière, because, as I've just sketched, the worker still requires an apprenticeship under the guidance of a theorist or of the party. Now, while I never entirely agree with Rancière about anything really, but what Rancière signals, I think, is something that has become widespread common sense today. And that's the failure of this particular political, cultural, and institutional form of transmission. This modelling of a body or a group or a form that would embody the knowledge of abstraction that would then be transmitted to others. This separation of urgency and abstraction seems inadequate and problematic, incarnating a sense of superiority and theoretical self-awareness that condemns most to ignorance. Push this towards chatty people. Why are they enjoying themselves? There's always something going on in some other teaching room. It's much more enjoyable than the room you're actually in. It's really frustrating. You can go and join. So that's the first moment. The second is the present moment of fusion. So in the present moment, the aim appears to be to fuse or integrate urgency and abstraction, or to suppose that they are already fused. Far from contrasting or separating these two functions, the claim is that the very dominance of abstraction, the penetration of abstraction into all forms of life, or the subsumption of all life by the abstract, licenses or generates an immediately urgent politics that contest these abstractions on their own grounds. Reality justifies the leftism that Althusser abhorred with, and to use Rancière's phrase, its premature suturing of the time of research and the time of empirical politics. So it's reality that licenses this premature suturing. It is often, although not always, life that is the key anti-mediating mediator that connects or fuses abstraction and urgency. The entry of abstraction into life in all its forms results in a life that is not simply recuperated, but itself becomes an abstract force, a force that can immediately overturn the dominance of abstractions. In Negri's formulation, there where the abstract subsumed life, life has subsumed the abstract. And this connects to a project that I'm failing to work on, but want to work on, which is a book, A Critique of Vitalism. So there's a common kind of vitalist moment which supposes that once life is kind of subsumed, this is not a kind of disaster, but is actually a birth of a new form of power. In The Crying of Lot 49, Thomas Pynchon expressed an early intuition of this situation of abstraction, vectored, as would often be the case, through California, land of abstraction. Reflecting on his fictional city, San Francisco, Pynchon wrote, like many named places in California, it was less an identifiable city than a group of concepts. Census tracts, special purpose bond issue districts, shopping nuclei, all overlaid with access roads to its own freeway. The reduction of place to concepts, notably concepts of property, consumption and transit, is one signature of the force of real abstractions. In fact, for a novel that is familiar really for its narrative of postal conspiracy and epistemological paranoia, what's interesting, as I just reread it, is how concerned it is with inheritance and property, rather traditional issues of the novel. Reality in the time of real subsumption, we might say, is a group of concepts, to use Pynchon's phrase. The inhuman complexity of current forms of abstraction, one thinks most notably of the recent discussions of high-frequency trading, does not, in this way of thinking, lead to an infinite complexity of resistance. Rather, the claim that abstraction irreparably hollows out the core of things, to quote Simmel on money, results in a radical simplification. If everything is abstract, or equally abstract, then new battle lines can be drawn or generated out of this desert of abstractions. The result is that abstraction results in the urgency of an insurrectional imaginary in which resistance can appear at every point as abstraction dominates at every point. So this is what I want to suggest is a kind of quite widespread contemporary mode of thinking. I'll trace in at least a couple of its better known instances. So rather than, if you would like you'd say, the kind of cliche that kind of complete abstraction leads to complete recuperation, a kind of end of resistance, a terminal model, the irony is that complete abstraction leads to insurrection. This insurrectional imaginary has been best summed up by Furio Jay's text on the Spartacist uprising, written in 1969, but not published in Italian until 20 years later, and only this year in English. For Jay, revolt involves the suspension of historical time, unlike revolution, which is the immersion in historical time. The insurrection, or the revolt, is immediate, Manichean, and anti-organisational. It erupts, and we are impelled to join. We fight with what is at hand against the monstrous adversaries that confront us, dealing not with abstract capitalists, but with demonic repositories of power, as he puts it. It is this immediacy of insurrection that is crucial to the fusion of urgency and abstraction. In the urgent moment of insurrection, the abstract is made concrete, brought down to earth in the figure of the enemy, and the struggle resolved into battle. To take my first contemporary example, which is the work of Tikkun, and in particular their controversial, to put it mildly, theorization of the young girl, jeune fille. The jeune fille is the figure of abstraction deepened to such an extent that, to use one of the most controversial moments in the controversial book, it appears that all the concreteness of the world has taken refuge in the ass of the young girl. In this piece of cultural analysis, if we want to dignify it as cultural analysis, we find a radical flattening in which all culture aspires or becomes the young girl, which is the slightly unconvincing response to accusations of misogyny or sexism. Everything is the young girl. I think the Pope's a young girl, in my memory. Could be. I think it was the last Pope, not the new one. Seems slightly cooler, if you think can be said. So the young girl, the jeune fille, is the figure of, quote, total nihilism, the unbridled reign of abstraction in which the concrete is finally the sexualized element at its extreme. While this might pass as a kind of contemporary version of the pessimism of the caricatural Frankfurt School, which is one of the more unfortunate founding myths of cultural studies, in fact, this hollowing, this nihilism, licenses the insurrectional imaginary that's at work in Tikkun's other texts. The ethical, as they put it, aim of Tikkun is to turn the desert, in which all cultural developments tend to the young girl, into a war, through the antagonism that emerges out of this absolute opposition. The opposition between complete abstraction and forms of life. This polarisation, as they call it, requires political activity. Hence, urgency is not simply given. The force of abstraction, which creates a continuous field, requires, quote, the imaginary party as the outside of the world without outside, the essential discontinuity lodged at the heart of a world rendered continuous. It's interesting, really, I think that there hasn't been, as far as I know, that much discussion of this element of their thought, of the imaginary party. People tend to focus more on the kind of spontaneity. The imaginary party is required as an intervention to polarise this opposition. And Tikkun's theorisation appeals to Carl Schmitt's distinction of the friend-enemy as crucial to this process of politicisation. Obviously, Schmitt defines the political as a field in terms of the friend-enemy distinction. Schmitt himself, obviously, not a nice man. Yes, I won't bother saying more. Schmitt wants to use this polarisation of the political to resist communism. For Schmitt, the truly global abstract is communism, while an actual politics requires a territorial form. Hence, if you haven't read it, The Theory of the Partisan by Schmitt is a very interesting, it's a completely bonkers book. But he quite likes Mao because it's kind of semi-nationalist, it's kind of based on the peasantry. He dislikes Lenin most of all because Lenin is most internationalist. So for Schmitt, the abstraction to be resisted is global communism, whereas Tikkun obviously recasts this to suggest that the enemy is capitalist abstraction as the force of capital. So Schmitt's vitalist polarisation, Schmitt argues that to have politics we need to kind of polarise around a friend-enemy, is reworked by Tikkun into the antagonism of global civil war, the internal fault line of global capital. So that's one version. Second version that I want to briefly talk about is communisation theory. Now, the currents of communisation don't depend on so much on this vitalist element, but they also refer to the immediacy of abstraction as leading to the urgency of insurrection. Although the process of communisation itself, that is for them synonymous with revolution, is often imagined as taking a very long time, even several hundred years. This form of communisation theory is what Gilles Dauvet has called critically proletarian structuralism, in which the capital-labour relation structures the forms of possible overcoming. In this narrative, the increasing dominance of real subsumption has hollowed out the traditional forms of workers' institutions, parties, unions, states. These were affirmative counterpoles to capital, which also supported the capital-labour relation. So they were kind of internally antagonistic, but also internally supportive. Now there is no affirmation of these alternatives due to both capitalist restructuring, which has removed their kind of basis, and the resistance of workers. The new situation of real subsumption results in class identity being regarded as an external constraint that has to be overcome in the process of revolution. So in the case of communisation theory, you can no longer continue to be a worker. The identity of a worker has been foreclosed, both by capital and by struggles. So what the suggestion is here, in some way, is that the structure of the capital-labour relation does the work of leading to insurrection. You have to be insurrectional because there's no identity to affirm. So in both cases, and this is what I'm calling the insurrectional imaginary, it's the result of the global dominance of abstraction, which is taken as solving the problems of the mediation of theory. So theory, in a sense, is removed because the reality of abstractions does the work for you. Now it is no longer a matter of a necessarily abstract theory capable of grasping abstraction and guiding practice, the very pedagogic practice that Jacques Rancière repeatedly and consistently denounced. We are all educated in abstraction in daily life, and at the same time in the unlivable nature of these abstractions. The abstractions themselves drive the urgency as we grasp their effects on our lives. So that's the fusion argument. Stuart Hall and his critique. So what I want to do now is reflect on a particular moment from Stuart Hall's large and complex body of work, which I think speaks or can be made to speak to this question or problem. And this is his argument that we think a, quote, Marxism without guarantees, which involves understanding determinacy in terms of setting limits, the establishment of parameters, the defining of the space of operations, rather than in terms of the absolute predictability of particular outcomes. So what Hall is trying to do is negotiate the tricky and still remainingly tricky question of base superstructure and determination. Hall wanted to incorporate some of the new developments in what came to be called post-Marxism and what Ellen Meiskins-Wood excoriated as the new true socialism, without abandoning the central insights of Marxism. There's quite a good quote in Meiskins-Wood about Stuart Hall. She says, his theoretical statements are sufficiently ambiguous and his movements in a new true socialism direction are so often accompanied by qualifications and disclaimers that it is not always easy to know exactly where he stands. It's a polite way of saying I can't nail him, so I'll just drop him into the footnote and leave him there. Further advice for future PhD students. Drop problems into the footnotes and hope that no one notices them. I'm an inveterate reader of footnotes. I probably would. So for Hall, we have to rewrite or read Marxism as insisting on, quote, determination by the economic in the first instance. So this is Hall's elegant, perhaps too neat solution. Rather than determination in the last instance, determination in the first instance. The economic then sets parameters, sets limits to politics. So what Hall is negotiating really are two positions, two problems. The first, an economic determinism in which the base determines the superstructure, sets politics. And on the second, a post-Marxist linguistic indeterminism in which the political floats free of the economic. The economic becomes just always wanted a job as a doorman. In which the economic is just one instance amongst others. This is again as a kind of classical element of traditional, if you like, cultural studies. The economic's there, but it's just one instance. There are loads of other instances. So Hall is trying to kind of avoid both these problems. And I want to suggest there is a certain kind of repetition of these positions at the present moment in a slightly different form. So first I'll talk about the repetition and then why I think it's slightly different. So I've already suggested, I think, how in certain ways some theorizations of the present moment involve a quasi-deterministic understanding, and particularly within some currents of communization. So as I've said, the idea that the capital-labour relation in its present form in the time of real subsumption structures the possibilities of resistance and insurrection suggests that you can only do communization because of the current situation of capital. So there's a kind of economic determinism at work. And this is particularly explicit in the extreme anti-voluntarism of Peter Astrom's text, Crisis and Communization, which is in SIC 1. And it's not, I always like people who take positions to extremes, because I think that at least they take it seriously and try to actually kind of play it out to the max. So it's kind of, I always find it slightly more interesting than probably what I do, which is that slightly woolly, could be this, could be that. So he takes it to the extreme by arguing that in communization, determinacy is inexorable. We are compelled into communization by the material conditions of capital, by the march of abstraction and subsumption. The fact that we cannot reproduce ourselves as workers will lead to communisation. We have nowhere else to go. And the text is interesting because there's a kind of addendum where the other members of the groups involved in producing SIP say, hold on, we don't want to go that far. And Peter Astrom defends himself against their arguments. What happens here is that consciousness drops out to be replaced by the driving force of abstraction and subsumption that forces us into communisation, the abandonment of any affirmation of workers' identity. So the implication is that the conditions of capital-labour relation will do the work for you. You don't need to think about it because you have no option. And it's interesting, and I think it's generally true, discussed, but I think it is, that communisation has not dealt in much depth with questions of consciousness, ideology or culture. Its stringent and salutary insistence on the capital relation is a necessary correction to the tendency to abandon any reference to the economic that was at times found in work like Laclau's and a wider structure of feeling that celebrated indeterminacy in the 1990s. So there's something kind of refreshing about communisation theory, it's saying. Let's go back to a kind of determinism. That said, and here's where cultural studies returns or questions posed from that kind of field, the question or problem of consciousness can't simply be conjured away. There's a tendency in communisation theory to displace problems of consciousness or awareness into the process of revolution itself, qua communisation. So the tendency is to discuss the question of kind of consciousness or awareness only as a problem in the revolution. The danger of falling back into socialism or capitalism, the dangers of fascism, are treated as deviations within a revolutionary process. There is less attention to problems of consciousness and struggle now, although there are some exceptions. For example, Rob Lucas has a very interesting text on the difficulty of organising for kind of free-floating or precarious workers. So this is a kind of determinism position at the moment. The second symmetrical position at the present time is the reaction to the determinism of abstraction by an insistence on the possibilities of will to break the hegemony of the current moment. Will, or fanaticism, or zealotry, promise the means to cut the Gordian knot of abstraction. In the work of Peter Howard on will, or the late Joel Olson on zealotry, the stress is on the possibilities of a line of division, a prescription that can cut or divide the political. So again, in the face of the kind of dominance of abstraction, there is an insistence on a surplus of possibility of using will or zealotry to fight or defeat them. Contrary again to political neutralisation, to use Schmidt's term, especially the emptying force of abstractions, the emphasis again is on a vital politics, very similar to Tikkun's, that can radicalise the present moment. Now, while wildly different in many ways, this insistence on indeterminacy and the capacity of will risks a symmetry with a Laclauian insistence on the always possible fluidity of language as a site of reinscription. So Stuart Hall, when he was writing, was obviously targeting Laclau and those post-Marxists. He argued that they replaced an unsatisfactory conception of ideology articulated around class blocks with an equally unsatisfactory discursive notion which implies total free-floatingness of all ideological elements and discourses. Laclau and notably Chantal Mouffe argue for the Schmittian possibility of drawing out a friend-enemy distinction through a populism that inscribes a difference in language. In their work, the vitality lies on the side of language, a kind of battle over signifiers, battle over master signifiers. But the irony is that the move is not that dissimilar to a politics of prescription. On the one hand, the vitality of the protean will, on the other, the vitality of protean signifiers. In both cases, an ever-renewed possibility of resistance that floats over or beyond the economic. It remains undetermined in either the first or the last instance. So while Hall was intervening in a very different context in the early 80s, I'm suggesting the problem of an alternative between determinism and indeterminism persists at the present moment. Hall's proposal was to re-engage Marxism with a determination in the first instance as an answer to the reductions of both economism and the reductions of post-Marxism. These are not the alternatives that confront us. In fact, in the present moment, there is much greater recognition of the determination by the economic, and then an attempt to engage with whether we are fully determined or can somehow escape determinism. So, in a sense, it's the effect of the crisis. No one needs convincing that the economic is determinate because we're all living it. It's like I always say, everyone said in the 90s there are all these different forms of capital. The moment capitalism became into crisis, everyone started talking about this one global thing, capitalism, again. Save capitalism. So the crisis itself has produced an awareness of the economic. This accounts for the stress on the fusion between urgency and abstraction in the present moment and the short circuit of analysis. Whereas if we go back to Hall's model, he is responding, I think, to that earlier sense of separation. Hall is modelling a kind of distance model, as if a decision could be made and then applied in a particular instance. So if you read Hall's work, it's like a kind of debate about how we do the kind of theory. Whereas in the present moment, the kind of theory is collapsed into reality. That said, Hall's insistence on the mediation of determination, that we begin from it rather than end with it, I think is still crucial intervention. There is, however, a difficulty that emerges in Hall's propositions, which is worth recalling. In his later work on New Times, the questioning of class essentialism coquettes with the dissolution of the problems of class altogether. I'm afraid, having vaguely lived through it, in the sense of having actually read issues of Marxism today, New Times is not a good thing from my point of view. A text by Hall, like for Alan White's Metaphors of Transformation from 1993, seems to push his Gramscianism into a congruence with a Foucauldian view of plural powers and resistance that floats free of class. The problem here is that a thinking of mediation and complexity risks blocking any thinking of the political or even revolution. This insistence on complexity converges with the pop-Burkeanism that dominates much of the contemporary humanities in the forms of invocations of historical density and interconnectedness. So this, I say, is the kind of common sense of the humanities today. Everything is connected, everything is dense, everything is complex. Hall did not embrace this conclusion entirely. And I think his work is salutary again in that complexity and mediation does not entail the refusal of politics, transformation, or revolution. Okay, so to conclude, sorry, it's an incredibly hot room. I can't do anything about the heat. Feel free, if you can. Usually my experience of institutions is that you can never open the windows when it's hot. Or you can go to Sussex where they have the automatic windows open and close randomly to the point where everyone just gets annoyed and turns them off, nullifying the hugely expensive ecological effect. Anyway, you're not really thinking unless you're sweating. Roland Barthes says about historical film, the sign of moral feeling is sweat. He does, it's a great essay. Romans in films. Okay, sorry. To conclude. The most resonant of Stuart Hall's text for the present moment is no doubt the collective volume Policing the Crisis from 1978, as many people have remarked. Hall and his co-authors explore the economic crisis of the 1970s and the cashing out of this crisis in the project by the right to project an image of black criminality in the form of mugging. What this work explores is the articulation of class through race, where this is not, in inverted commas, where this is not some mere subsidiary problem, but the mode of segmentation itself. So Hall and his co-authors are constantly insistent that race is not some kind of additional problem, but is actually crucial to the division and segmentation of society. What's interesting, and I think important, is that they argue that crisis does not resolve this segmentation in any levelling down process, but exacerbates the articulation and sediments it in the hegemonic project of the ruling class to resolve the crisis. So the point here is that, contrary to some images of crisis, crisis doesn't lead to we're all in it together. In fact, crisis exacerbates divisions in the working class in this case, and these divisions are then articulated by the right, as Hall traces it, to resolve the crisis to their benefit. Obviously, I live, because I live on the south coast in UKIP land, so you might get an echo of this process at present. And I think this is a crucial point. Simplification through crisis arguments then and now, I think, are deeply problematic. Louis George Schwartz, in his work on film, has noted that in our time of what he calls false assumption and crisis, we find a situation of generalised hostility. Tracking this through cinema, he talks of what he calls cinema hostis, in which each is the enemy of each and the camera is the enemy of all. So again, this is a kind of insistence on a crisis leading to generalised hostility. Although I should say that, again, the problem is here is about the generalisation, because how general is general hostility is what we're talking about. And I think what Hall's work is important to remind us is that this hostility is not so much general as segmented. It falls on particular groups and people. If you have a model of general hostility, again, you can resolve it by kind of some leap to general agreement. So, while the crisis that Hall and his colleagues explored should obviously not be mistaken for our moment of crisis, especially because the crisis that Hall traced still involved previous forms of quote-unquote socialist resistance, which are lacking in the present, the resonances, as I've suggested, are still striking. The experience of black Britons that Hall and his co-authors analysed as a fraction or element of the reserve army of labour or of surplus population left them abandoned by many of the protections, in inverted commas, of capitalist life and recalcitrant to the promises of socialist organisation. Hall and his co-authors argued that this amounted to the possibility for a different form of politicisation, particularly one made on the grounds of the refusal of work. What's interesting, as Alberto and others have pointed out, is that if you read the 78 text, is a reference to operaismo and Italian thought. It's almost like people found it and then forgot about it for about 15, 20 years, which was annoying. And the other reference that Hall and his co-authors make is to a lumpen politics proposed by Fanon and the Black Panthers. These forms of politicisation begin from crisis. The crisis of the model of the proletariat and the necessity to grasp the torsions of that identity as a limit to be overcome. So while charting these debates, Hall and his co-authors are also aware of the limits of these new forms of politicisation, and I think this is my kind of finishing point. A couple more paragraphs. They note the tensions and problems of the claims for a political status given to crime as a mode of resistance that could be translated into a broader insurgent strategy. So this is the kind of usual argument that crime is not crime. Crime is a mode of protest, an inchoate mode of resistance to capitalist society that can then become a model of wider resistance. But they argue there is a tension here. And the final sentence of the book seems to me essential advice. The difficulty of translating crime into political resistance, sets up a necessary warning about any strategy which is simply based on favouring current modes of resistance in the hope that, in and of themselves, by natural evolution rather than break and transformation, they could become spontaneously another thing. So, in this argument, urgency and abstraction are not so much separate, with abstraction being the condition of urgency, nor are they fused with abstraction producing political urgency. Rather, the relation of abstraction in the form of crisis and urgency in the form of crime as a mode of survival are interrupted by the demand for a strategy that could operate by break and transformation. We return again to Lenin, or an echo of Lenin: evolution and spontaneity versus break and transformation. But in both cases, we have the absence of Leninist forms of party and institution. The result is a double tension. First, a return to the problem of mediation, which I've been arguing for, implies that full abstraction does not easily resolve the problem of the cultural. This implies, if not the pedagogic in the bad sense indicated by Rancière, at least the difficulty of tracing culture as the mediation of abstraction and struggle, in the seeming massive presence of the one, abstraction, and the relative absence of the other, struggle. So the cultural becomes a question again. This links to the second tension, which is the invocation of break and transformation. Break and transformation in the absence of the party or some other embodied form capable of carrying consciousness. So two tensions: the necessity to mediate and respect the complexity of that without abandoning a model of break and transformation, and the difficulty of finding an embodiment of the break and transformation. And this, to make a depressing conclusion, as I like to do, is the double tension of the present moment. The problem of what we could call class consciousness without a party. Thank you.
We've got about 15 minutes left, if anyone would like to ask any questions. Anyone? Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I always was, you said, for example, because they said with the UKIP brand, and I was reading about an article where they said that they see Farage as representing an identity and a set of values they cherish, but do not see expressed anywhere else in the Labour Party. And they're saying that Labour has got a deep problem because the white working class are moving towards Farage because Farage is articulating some deep need that they have which hasn't been before. What's your take on this? Does it write in your way?
It's a very difficult question to answer. It's okay. The first thing which I don't know, which I would like to know, is the voting composition of UKIP supporters. Because my suspicion is that the voting composition of UKIP supporters is not necessarily the quote-unquote white working class, but the usual extreme right-wing Tory types who are more unhappy with the Conservative Party than they are with Labour. So it's difficult, I think, to make that judgment without knowing who's voting for them, particularly, which I see a lot where I live, the kind of fact that voting seems to be mainly done and involve older people and very small numbers of people. Obviously, I think the turnout was about 32%. So there's that problem. Is it actually the white, quote-unquote, white working class voting for them? And then I think my very sketchy answer, because I haven't really done any work on it, would be that I think this is it's another mode of segmentation. It's the creation of a pseudo-identity, a cultural identity. Badiou would say a false difference to resist the same identity of class. So the focus on a quote-unquote white working class is which again involves social issues of often the representations of this white working class are people who are not working, people on the dole. I try to avoid watching all those programs that are about people on the dole. So again, I think this is one of the ways in which the right is kind of succeeding by creating new segmentations, new cultural identities, which are, to use an old word, false and untrue. So I think with the UKIP thing, it is a worrying suggestion that crisis doesn't lead to radicalisation to the left. The crisis can lead to it to the right. And the dissolution of traditional quote-unquote forms of workers' identity does not lead to any quote-unquote immediate political gain. So that's my kind of rough answer. You would need a proper sociologist.
I wanted to ask about the, even it's somewhat tangential to the argument, about the link of political theories based on either will or voluntarism or prescription. You mentioned Bill Olson's work and Peter Hallward's, to the thematic of vitalism. Because in a way, well, I could surmise where you might be going. It's not a straightforward identity or equation. So I guess one could hypothetically pose forms of voluntarism or indeed of decisionism that might not require the resource of a kind of vitalist or quasi-vitalist metaphysic. And that's in a sense the first part. So I guess the second aspect of it is that it seems then that in those positions that get categorized under communization theory, there's the continuation, which I guess is the other side of the argument about determinacy, of something like a Marxist critique of Jacobinism as the critique of those positions that substitute political powerlessness or the absence of the social base with some seemingly overarching and potent principle of politics. So I was just wondering how these questions of the equation between voluntarism and vital, the possible equation between voluntarism and vitalism, and then this, in a sense, mutual critique between kind of anti-Jacobin communization theory and the theory of the will work ethic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't have to be linked to vitalism, although it's interesting how often it is, in one way or another. I mean, I think this is partly maybe my excuse for not finishing this book, is that vitalism is interesting because it kind of spreads everywhere like its own description of life. So it becomes very hard to kind of draw a limit around the kind of vital politics. But in the kind of emphasis on the will, I think it's obviously interesting that the defence is often of forms of life against other anti-life things, so against abstraction. So there's a tendency, I think, to pose it, and obviously Joel's work, which is still, this is an unfortunate death. I mean, there hasn't been kind of put out yet, but he talks about the kind of Protestant anti-abortion zealots. There's a zealotry for life there, and there is also certain kinds of modes of zealotry for life within more left-wing versions. But it doesn't have to be linked, but I think it's interesting how often it is linked. The way you polarise the will, if I think that Peter and Joel, I guess, both struggle with this problem, is that you pose a category of will, or you pose a category of zealotry, and then you have to find like the good version of it, and the good polarisation, because it describes just a general effect of the political. Any political project requires will or zealotry as its extreme. It requires that drive, and then they have to kind of find ways to decide what's a good one or a bad one. That doesn't have to rest on life itself as a value. It can rest on, in teachers it's a more abstract, usually a universalism. But in the Tikkun version, that universalism is forms of life. So while it doesn't have to be vitalist, it often is. That would be my general point. And the second one, I mean, it's always hard talking about communisation. It always seems to lead to arguments with people. But again, there are different variants and different forms of it, as I mentioned. And, what interests me, I find it interesting, and like you say, it's salutary for its kind of anti-Jacobinism, anti-Leninism. It's broadly an anti-Leninist position, it's an ultra-left position, but then of course, like all those positions, it ends up in the problem. It's like, what are you going to replace those forms with? What is going to do the work of the quote-unquote party? I'm not arguing return to the party form, but there's going to have to be something that does that operation of consciousness. And it's what's interesting in Roland Simonis stuff is like class consciousness gets mentioned, and then there's not much about what that would actually be. So while you can, you have a symmetry, I guess, between, Peter's always explicit adoption of Jacobinism and then this anti-Jacobinism. I mean, they're both struggling, like we all are, with the same problem. Me saying mediation is not meant to be a great answer. Mediation is just another way of saying this is the problem. How do you integrate or articulate urgency and abstraction, which is, it's a great title. I think it's a really great way of posing that problem. It's how do you interlock them together, and how do you think of what is actually the mediating instance? And I think that's the problem.
Yeah, I'm just wondering on your thoughts on the crisis, because I think it's a strange thing. The crisis itself was a crisis of abstraction. Nothing actually happened. It was just relation to property values, to credit circulation, you could say, to an extent. And then it becomes kind of real in a sense. But I don't know, it's like there seems to me to be a kind of global scale of dealing with valorization and devalorization. That's kind of hard to deal with in a local sense. So it seems to be, I don't know, there's almost kind of abstraction from below in a lot of movements. It seems to be like questions of being together, maybe almost like a temporary polis to discuss concepts like democracy. Maybe because as well in some areas where, I don't know, you've had, say, devalorization, maybe, I don't know, material types of work have kind of arisen, like, say, after the 70s to kind of create work in here, well, I don't know, almost kind of following that kind of Tronti's idea that, in a way, the reaction to a crisis by the workers also creates the capitalism to kind of change as well. I mean, do you think, like with the kind of current movements that seem to kind of rise up and kind of demand a more like a real democracy or something, they don't seem to have any power to really challenge capital, but is that weirdly that the fact they kind of almost collapse in a kind of abstraction from below, that they kind of then capital, I mean, it just seems like here in London, for example, they're just going on with the same economic system that caused the crash. So, I mean, are we kind of entering a kind of phase of just kind of, I don't know, a kind of real subsumption without maybe a kind of, I don't know, a kind of way out?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two questions, of both of which I'll try and say some things about. I mean, the first one is about the nature of crisis itself, which I think is very interesting because the temporality is becoming longer and longer, which is interesting. 2008 to 6 years, and what I think is interesting is this sort of drawn-out sense of crisis. Roberto's done some work on the temporality of crisis in medical terms. So the terminal patient isn't dying; it keeps on dying. It's taking years but not dying. A kind of weird version of Agamben's bare life, or fortunately unfortunate death of Franco. Spent so long dying, you just keep waking up begging to be killed, pass out. So there's something interesting about that temporal fact that the crisis is drawn out. Also, it's obviously, which I'm not an expert on, is geographically uneven distribution, as you say, with some countries sort of experiencing growth, and then people sort of all waiting, seems to be the current, at least my friends on Facebook, all waiting for China to stop growing. Then we'll have a global crisis. But what's interesting about that, which links to your second point, is that crisis isn't resolving the political problems. I don't think it ever did. But there's a kind of imaginary or a sense of that crisis should, galvanise an anti-capitalist project, which to some extent it did in the 1930s. And I think that is that problem. That crisis isn't rolling itself out in a kind of clear way. Your second point, it's interesting. I don't have. It's easy to say to people, you should really be anti-capitalist. Why aren't you anti-capitalist enough? But that comes back to this problem I said about class consciousness without a party. Sort of lecturing people about you should really be more anti-capitalist. It's one thing to do, but it's interesting, like you say. I think it is a reaction, as you're suggesting, to the devalorization, a kind of collapse in the faith in any political party in places like Spain. The only alternative is to, like you say, a kind of real democracy, anyone but them politics, which certainly, as a justification, it's obviously we live in the UK where that kind of politics, because we're such a reactionary country, always seems to go to the right, and obviously we're seeing with the Euro elections this sort of polarisation. So, and it happened in Italy, obviously, the crisis of the political class didn't again lead to a anti-capitalist or anti-anarchist, didn't lead to anarchist politics, led just to a kind of general disgust with any politics at all, and a kind of retreat into the quote-unquote democracy of the market itself. If you take Marx's comments on civil society or bourgeois society, that I can't trust any of them, so I might as well look after myself. And there, I think there is a pessimism. I'm always accused of pessimism. I always say I'm not, but I probably am. But that is the political problem. The hollowing out of the traditional forms of identity, which quote unquote good and been going on for a lot longer than I think people think, but it's like what is going to replace that? And it's, I'm suspicious of the trust in a kind of spontaneity of everyone's in it, a 99% politics, which has been galvanising, but obviously then it confronts its limits in the segmentation of who is in, who is out. So although those movements have their power, what is striking is how they hit, like any politics, they hit limits and then seem to kind of dissipate. So I am suspicious of sort of the valorization of that as like, it's spontaneous and then it ebbs and flows like life, this kind of vitalist kind of justification, whereas I think it's a problem that they emerge and collapse in these moments.
We've got about 10 minutes left.
Can I just clarify something you said earlier? Did you say that with Marx it was a kind of retreat from urgency of the commune into abstraction, and with Lenin was kind of the inverse process, right, from abstraction to urgency?
Not exactly, sorry. I have so many mentions of the words urgency and abstraction.
Yeah,
that's what happens when you try and address the conference theme to excess. No, what I was saying was, it's a bit of a cliche, but in the case of Marx, there's a galvanising moment of 1848, Communist Manifesto, and then the retreat, inverted commas, into the library in 1850 to start working on capital, which takes a very long time, as I joked. And then in 1871, there's a kind of re-engagement with the commune as the proletarian, the model of a future proletarian society. So what I'm saying in Marx is, it's a bit of a cliche, but there's a retreat into abstraction to work out what capitalist society is, and a re-engagement with the Paris Commune as this sign of the future. And I was saying there's a similarity, if you like, to Lenin's horror at the European Social Democratic parties voting for war, the kind of war fever, so he retreats into reading Clausewitz and Hegel's Science of Logic, and then re-engages with urgency in 1917. So I'm drawing a parallel between a kind of a contrast between the moment of abstraction as a moment of patient reflection, that for these forms, like I say, it would be the cliche that philosophy just keep going with abstractions forever, whereas the point is to change it. The practice element of Marxism would be that the work of abstraction is a condition then for an urgency. If that makes sense. So both Lenin and Marx kind of retreat to do work on abstraction so they can later engage with that urgency.
Because I was thinking of terms of this fusion, because you talked a lot about like mediation, and I was sort of thinking in terms of this fusion, in terms of Gramsci later, and how, like, for example, I mean, obviously, like, is in prison, so it's almost like confined to kind of abstraction. It's no other choice, I suppose. But within that, he kind of finds the time, the urgency to actually write a massive theoretical type of work. And one of the things that's interesting he talks about is he quotes a sentence from Lenin several times, which is, I think, is after the Third International. And what Lenin actually said was, the failure of communism, what the failure was, is that we've been unable to present our experience to foreigners. But Gramsci mistranslates this and doesn't remember it, probably doesn't have access to the book, and he puts this actually as we have been unable to translate our language into European languages. And there's some people that look at this kind of this idea of translation. So I'm wondering if translation is some sort of alternative to this idea of transmission or mediation. Maybe even linking to Rancière, how he talks about like how the alternative to explication is translation, kind of condition of poetry that kind of you find yourself cornered. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's weirdly, it's just reading a paper for translation. On reading Capital as a work of translation. So yes, I mean I think I use mediation, the old word, sort of tendency to use old words, because I like them. But you would have certainly reframe in terms of translation. I don't know whether it would make it any easier to do, by doing that, because again, I guess even in Gramsci's moment, although he's obviously writing in the experience of defeat and the relative crushing of the Italian Communist Party, there's still a kind of, the modern prince is still the party, there's still a kind of belief in a capacity for a need for an institution of that form to do the work of translation. That's why my knowledge of Gramsci is probably not as great as yours or most people's. But Gramsci's kind of interest in the Catholic Church is, the Catholic Church has been a very successful institution because of its ability to both appeal to intellectuals through its theologians and to translate that into a popular appeal through priests at a local level. So this is why he's interested in the Communist Party itself, being able to do this work of translation. You have both high theory and then a translation of work. So the thing is there, which is why I guess what's interesting about Hall's work and cultural studies is there is a Gramscianism in that work, but a Gramscianism without a party, or for all intents and purposes without a party, because Communist Party of Great Britain, not my favourite political institution of all time, shall we say. I mean, I guess what's interesting there in terms of translation is the Communist Party of Great Britain's project around hegemony was to embrace right-wing Laborism, to be violently opposed to Tony Benn, fairly opposed to the miners' strike, to endorse a kind of rightward drift in Labour as that would be the hegemonic, because it was appealing to more people. So there's a kind of interesting question about, like you say, translation or mediation or transmission. How do you define an appeal? Is it just one? Is it Lenin's better, less but better, or is it as many people as possible? So I think there's an interesting problem with not Gramsci's ideas, but certainly the uses of Gramsci.
probably got time for one more question.
Happy to answer them in a cooler space.
I guess we should just bring it to a closing point then. I think to say thanks again to Dr. Noys.